Good evening, Stephen.
Oh,
Paul.
hi. Did you get the notes for the meeting?
Yeah, I sent out notes, didn't I?
No, I didn't get that.
No,
That was when?
I'll email them. Okay, did you get notes
Hang on.
for tonight? Oh, don't tell me I didn't attach them. Oh boy, oh boy, hang on. Notes, I've got the email here. Yeah, I attached the notes, Stephen.
Oh,
In the email I sent out for tonight's meeting, there should be an attachment in that email.
yeah.
Yeah.
Did you send it today, or I'm just wondering?
Oh, a few days.
Yesterday, yeah.
Yeah, a few days ago.
2 days ago.
Hey.
Okay.
Or
Sorry.
yesterday.
Yes,
You know,
yeah. Okay, I'll just check my emails and.
it should be there.
Okay.
Hi.
Stephen, I'll tell you precisely when. It's 10:19 last night.
Well, there you go.
Okay, I'll just check. Yeah. 10:19.
You just told me to move on.
More inboxes. Okay, it's 10. All right, PM.
Yes.
West and northwest, the rain moved into the northeast as that low slid down from New South Wales. For Melbourne up to 9 o'clock this morning, but nothing has been recorded in town since then. Our high of 22 came at 20 past 2 this afternoon. I ended up getting about 19 millimetres of rain today, with partly cloudy conditions there this evening, slightly more rain for Canberra. The low has been causing all from
Have they got a film?
They got a what?
Do you want
A
to
film?
go
Oh,
down
maybe
this?
it's a film. But I don't think it makes any difference.
Makes a bit of a difference.
Oh. Oh, okay.
I guess we should mute.
No, I don't seem to have got them.
You didn't, Stephen? No?
I can't find them. You know.
I'm going to send it to you now.
Great. Yeah. Thanks.
To Steve Joshua. This is to sjjoshua56@gmail. Is that right?
SDSJ.
Yeah. That's the one. Yeah. I'll just put in. I'm just going to put in notes and I'll send it to you in 1 second.
No, I need the notes. We're
Yeah,
going
yeah.
to get them then. No, because I'm listening. I can't read at the same time. Well, send it to me and I'll print the thing on the printer. Oh, well, that's the printer. Send it to Bardet, okay?
Okay,
Yeah.
Stephen, I've just sent it to you.
Okay. Good.
So with a bit of luck,
I should get it.
it should arrive. Okay. All right, we'll start in a few minutes.
Hi, Paul.
Hello, hi.
That's good. Yeah, it went into my bin. Sorry.
Okay. Well, there you
Oh
go.
goodness. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Right. I'll just go to the printer.
Okay, I think we've got enough people for a minion here, so I think we'll make a start. So welcome again and good evening, everyone. Excuse my voice; it's a bit croaky, but last week my younger grandson was at home all week with stuff that he brought home from Kinder, and I also got lobbed with a couple of child-minding things. So I got whatever he got, you know. In fact, a whole lot of us got whatever he got. The only one who seems to have escaped it is my wife, who didn't do any child-minding last week. So she was the lucky one. Anyway, let's move on. So today we're actually going to shift gear completely. Because what we have actually done over the past couple of weeks is we've concentrated on the story of the Jews under Muslim rule. And tonight, and really next week, well, tonight and really for the remainder of the course, we're going to be focusing essentially on the Jews under Christian rule in Spain. But for a little while tonight, for a short time, we're still going to be talking about the Muslim story. Because, you know, we've got to talk a little bit about, you know, what were the circumstances that led to the eventual removal of the Muslims from Spain in the context of what is called the Christian Reconquista. That's going to be the focus of our discussion tonight. So if we go to the notes that I sent you, I've sort of put together in a chart form hopefully a fairly intelligible timeline, or sort of a conceptual timeline more than anything else, to give you a sort of an idea of the Reconquista. We're not going to focus in this first bit on the Jewish narrative. We're going to focus essentially on a little bit of Spanish history to set the context for the Jewish story. Otherwise, that Jewish narrative just is less meaningful, let's put it like that. So the point that I make here at the beginning is that the Reconquista began very soon after the Islamic conquest of Spain in 711. That's something we, of course, we mentioned already in the first class and in the second class. And so it began not long after that, but also passed through various phases before its completion. And in fact, there's a very seminal battle. So about 11 years after the Islamic conquest of Spain, there is a battle. I'm going to put up a map in a minute, so you'll be able to see exactly what I'm talking about. In 722, there was a very important battle that took place in the extreme northwestern section of Spain, and that is the Battle of Covadonga. And the reason why that battle was so important is that it actually assured the survival of a tiny, as it was at the time, a tiny Christian stronghold in the northern part of Spain. It was the kingdom of Asturias. That was the part of Spain. And the reason why that battle is so important and the securing of a Christian stronghold is so important is that battle really marks the beginning of a very, very long process of the Christian reconquest of Spain known as the Reconquista. So I'm just going to share with you. I'm going to do quite a bit of slide sharing tonight, so I'll be in and out of the slides. But just let me begin with a couple of maps to make the point a lot clearer. So this is a map that you should remember. It's a map that I sort of brought up in the first and even in the second class. And what you can see, of course, in the year of 711, 1213, I mean, within a very, very short space of time, the vast majority of the Spanish peninsula, and by the way, the Portuguese peninsula as well, have been conquered by Islam in a very, very short space of time. But here's the thing, that section in yellow at the very top with the dots on it, that is what remained in Christian hands. And what actually happened is that the Muslims had tried to enter this part of Spain, very, very mountainous. So it was going to be challenging at the best of times. And there's interestingly, one historian has sort of put the view that one of the things that that stood in the way of them actually being able to get right right to the very end was the fact that they actually brought camels over. And I'm no expert in this, but apparently camels don't do particularly well in sort of mountainous regions. Horses and so on are a different story, but camels not. So it seems that, you know, the camels were the thing that were largely responsible for the eventual Christian reconquest of Spain, one might say, in a sense. But the important thing is that here you can see Covadonga at the very, very extreme northern section of Spain. And it is that battle that marks the beginning of the Reconquista. And if you look at this next map that I'm going to bring up for you, you can see what I mean by it being a lengthy process. Here you go. This is the map. And you can start to see it's quite well, you know, quite well delineated. The color makes it quite easy. You've got a copy of this in black and white on the second page, but don't worry about going backwards and forwards. I'll always have the relevant material up on the screen, but you can start to see that if you take the Battle of Covadonga in 722 up there, you know, 750, this section is reconquered, and then, and so on and so on and so on. And finally, the last outpost of Muslim rule is Granada. That is the Kingdom of Granada. And that was the kingdom that basically held out till the very end. And in 1492, finally, all Muslims were expelled from Spain. And by the way, coincidentally, of course, as many of you will know, it was the year in which Jews were also expelled from Spain, all right? And so on. So that just gives you graphically a sense that when we are talking about the Reconquista, we're talking about a very, very long process. I mean, it's almost 750 years from the time that the Reconquista began till the time it ended. So not only is it long, but it's very, very complex. I mean, I'm not a big one for military history. So when I started reading about this and sort of started getting lost in the detail, I sort of gave up because it's just not my shtick. But nevertheless, it's very, very complicated. It's backwards, forwards, and so on and so on. But at least it gives you a sort of an idea of, graphically at least, what this Reconquista involved and why it's such a lengthy sort of process. So question from someone?
Yeah, sorry, what would have been the population of Spain at the time?
Oh,
Total or in part?
I have no idea, Ergat. So, you know, so that's another thing which sort of goes a bit over my head. Military history and demography, you know. My answer to your question is that there were a heck of a lot of people around. All right. But I mean, the point I would make, by the way, about the Jewish population is that by the time we get to the year of about 750, 800, that sort of beginnings of the Golden Age, Spain is actually going to be home to the largest Jewish community in the world. So that's an important thing to just keep in mind. Okay. All right. So that's the Reconquista. Let's go back to the notes, and I'll keep going. And as I say here, the Reconquista was more complex than any simple account allows. It's a point that I made a minute ago. Now, why was that? Because Christian and Muslim rulers were often, in fact, divided and fought amongst themselves. Because you've got to remember that in last week's story, we spoke about the individual kingdoms of the Islamic rule, Taifas, and often they jealously guarded their own supremacy. So very often they were often fighting against each other. And look at this, sometimes, as you can see in the notes here, alliances would often be made across faith lines. That was not unusual. Because, you know, sometimes it was like, I want to get on top of this guy, so getting in bed with the Christians is not such a bad idea at the moment. So, and the other thing is that fighting along the Christian-Muslim frontier was also punctuated by periods of prolonged peace and truces as well. So that's why the story is so complicated to get your head around it. The important thing is, though, is that in its earliest stage, the Reconquista did not make serious inroads into Muslim Spain, right? It started, the Battle of Covadonga began, but it was a very, very, very slow process of trying to move southwards into the country. However, and this is the point that I'm going to stop at in a minute and share a map just to make the point very clear. Toledo, which is located pretty much in the center of the country, finally fell to the Christians in 1085. So that is a year that you really should, like, it's a very important year to sort of remember in Spanish history. 1085, you know, you ask Spanish kids in schools, and 1085 is almost like burnt into their memories, because it's a very, very important moment when the Christians are well on the way to finally reconquering Spain. So let me just to give you a sense graphically, so you can actually see what it is we're talking about. Let me again bring up my slide, and I'll go to the next one where you'll actually be able to see what it is that I'm talking about in the context of that. Here we go. So you can actually see Toledo around about there. So by 1085, the Christians have pretty well moved their way all the way down pretty much to the center of the country, right? So it gives you just a good, I think maps are important because they just give you a visual sense of things we're often talking about. And here you have just a little representation of the reconquest of Toledo. It's a big, big time moment. I mean, for example, here on the right-hand side, as you come into the city of Toledo, I mean, there are a number of entry points into Toledo. There's not just one road that leads you in. There are a number of entry points. But one entry point into the city of Toledo, you see coming in from that road behind, you actually see the back of this statue, and that is the king who conquered Toledo, the Christian king. His name is Alfonso VI. And he was eventually made a saint because of et cetera, et cetera. When I've led my tours, I've been to Spain with 6 or 7 groups, if not more, but certainly 6 or 7 groups. I always ask the bus driver and the guide to bring me in on this road, because as we enter this road, I read a short account of the conquest of Toledo, Alfonso leading the troops. I want people to get a little of the feel, even though they're sitting on a bus and not on horseback, a little bit of a feel of what it was like to enter the city of Toledo in 1085. But that dominates the city, this big, big roundabout. The other place where it's also quite prominent, by the way, this is a beautiful, beautiful panoramic view of the city of Toledo. And that's also a place where I take the group to not to see this view, but I'll talk about why a little bit later. But also you have here this beautiful ceramic wall, a wall made of sort of ceramic tiles, and basically it's in the Plaza España in Seville, and basically it depicts the conquest of Toledo by Alfonso VI. I mean, this has got, the next slide really has got nothing at all to do with our topic tonight, but I just want to give you a sense of where you would find that those tiles. Some of you may have been to the Plaza España. I mean, this is magnificent. This was built in 1929 for the World Trade Fair. It was held in Seville. So you get this amazing, amazing, it's one of my most favorite architectural pieces in Europe. Forget just Spain alone. By the way, one of the latest episodes of Star Wars was actually filmed here. If you're a Star Wars fanatic, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So this sort of, it was that. So they actually filmed this here. But that's what it looks like. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. But along here, you get little alcoves. And each region of Spain depicts an important part of its own story. And in one of those little alcoves, you come to Toledo, and that's where you see that particular depiction. So it just gives you a sense that, you know, if Toledo was going to make a choice about what it wanted to depict about itself, the most important thing was the fact that it represented the first major phase in the successful reconquest of Spain from the Muslims. So that just gives you just a little bit of a sense of what that actually looked like. Now, let us move on further into the notes. I will stop for questions when we get to the end of the story about the Reconquista. I will stop and take some questions. So let's go to the next part of the chart, where for a brief moment, I still want to talk now still about Muslim rule. Even though it's predominantly the Christian narrative, I want to talk still about Muslim rule, because what happens is this. When the Christians arrive in the city of Toledo in the year of 1085, it's a wake-up call for the Muslims, precisely because of where it's located. And also, Toledo was a very, very important center of Muslim life and culture. So alarmed, as I write here in the notes, alarmed by the Christian capture of Toledo, the Muslim city-states sought outside aid from the Almoravids. Now, who were the Almoravids? They were a highly conservative and austere sect of Muslim Berbers from North Africa. In other words, the Taifas were so weakened that they realized that they were not going to be able to withstand the Christian onslaught and went to North Africa to get help. So what then happened is that the Almoravids come across to Spain. They're a major kingdom in North Africa. And then, as I write here, after halting the Christian advance at Toledo, the Almoravids returned into Spain in 1090 and basically established control over the whole of Andalusia, southern Spain. And that really brings to an end the Taifa period. So if you think about the Muslim story in Spain, you remember it began with an emirate when Abd Rahman I came across. Then one of his ancestors established Cordoba as a caliphate. When that caliphate fell apart, it was replaced by individual Islamic kingdoms. And finally, the individual kingdoms come to an end, and there's once again centralized control under the Almoravids. Now, what does this mean for the Jews? Basically, one scholar, Benjamin Gamble, writes here, the situation of the Jews, in fact, deteriorated temporarily under a less tolerant rule of the Almoravids. As he writes here, the glittering society that once was Al-Andalus, if you want the golden age, began to lose its glitter. And one of the things that this resulted in was the departure of many Jews to the Christian north, especially Toledo. So this is a very important point to keep in mind, that as the Christians have recaptured the city from the Muslims, and as you get a less tolerant Muslim administration in Andalusia, Jews sort of begin to think, well, there's no point in hanging around here. Let's move to the Christian north of Toledo, where in fact they were welcome. Now, why they were welcomed, we will talk about a little bit later on, but that's the story. Now, if we go on in the notes, what then happens is that the Almoravids base in North Africa, remember they had their base there, came under attack from another Islamic sect of Berbers. They were known as Almohads, and they were even more fanatical and even more fundamentalist in a sense than the Almoravids. And what they actually ended up doing, as you can see in the notes, is that they deposed the last Almoravid ruler in North Africa in the year of 1147. And once they did, to help stem, I'm sorry, just a minute. I think, just bear with me, something's just gone a bit wacky here. Okay, all right, sorry about that. So they actually came across to Spain to help stem the Christian advance, because once even though the Christians had been stopped at Toledo, it was only temporarily. And so the Almohads came across to help stem that advance even further. So just to give you a little bit of well, it's all imaginary, it's in the mind of some artist, but just to give you a sense of who these folks were, the Almoravids and the Almohads. This is a sort of a thing. I think this actually, what I'm about to show you, appears in quite a lot of school textbooks. So you've got here the Almoravids, who came over, the first group. They were the less fanatical one. And you can actually see it makes the point that I made earlier. There's a combination of horses and camels. I remember I spoke about the camels being the problem before, but that was the Almoravids. The much more fanatical group are the Almohads. And even just the depiction of them, they just look more vicious. I mean, that looks like ISIS. That looks like ISIS. Whereas, I mean, these guys look like pussycats. you know, compared to it. And in fact, that was the case because the Almohads were fanatical fundamentalists. And really under the Almohads, Jewish life began to seriously deteriorate. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, if you go to Spain today, there is in fact very, very little evidence of the presence of the Almohads in Spain. I mean, one reason might be is that they were in fact not there for a long period of time. I mean, look, 1145 to 1212. So they didn't have a long enough period to leave a significant, you know, architectural mark on the place. But one thing that they did do, is that they built a magnificent mosque, or they completed a magnificent mosque. And the only thing that remains today of that mosque is this tower, the Giralda, it's called, the Giralda. I will talk more about that a little bit later, but that is all you see today in the city of Seville, that sort of allows you to see some sort of a presence of Almohads. They built this beautiful, beautiful thing. Notice, of course, at the very top, you actually have a Christian bell tower. So we're going to come back to that a little bit later, and I'll talk more about that. But let's go on further in the notes. The point that I make is that the Almohads, when they took control of Spain, initiated a policy of forced conversion. And this was very unusual because you remember, strictly speaking, under the Pact of Dimitude, as long as Jews behaved themselves, they were guaranteed protection of life and property and everything, and freedom of religious worship. But because the Almohads were so fanatically fundamentalist in their outlook, they basically just ignored the provisions of the pact and actually initiated a policy of forced conversion on the penalty of death. And this really extinguishes the last remaining vestiges of Jewish culture in Spain. So whatever debates historians have about when the Golden Age came to an end, and there's all sorts of different versions of it, certainly with the invasion of the Almohads, that is the end. That's the end of the story of Jews under Muslim rule. And what actually happened in that period, going to the last point before we keep talking about the Reconquista, is that Jews actually, what did they do in the face of this persecution? They either embraced Islam, but continued to practice their Judaism in secret, a bit like the later Marranos, of course, under Christian rule, or they fled Muslim Spain, or as I said earlier, they fled to the north, especially the city of Toledo. So one very good example from this period is Maimonides. And Maimonides was actually born in the city of Cordova, but he actually was a young boy of 12 at the time that the Almohads invaded Spain. And because of the forced persecution, his family actually left Cordova, right? And as I write here, many Jews, in fact, also ended up in the Christian north, adding to the numbers of the already rising Jewish communities in Christian Spain from the earlier period of the Almoravids. Again, I'm sure if you've been to Spain, this will be totally familiar. But let me just bring up the famous statue in Cordova. And of course, that is the statue of Maimonides. That if you've been to Cordova, you will have seen this, of course. It's a major tourist attraction. I mean, in the height of the tourist season, there's a very narrow street to get there, and it's absolutely just jam-packed with people queuing up to see Maimonides. Now, part of the legend, there's a legend that is attached to Maimonides. I'm sorry I don't have the full statue there, but he's actually wearing sort of golden slippers. And the legend is that if you touch the foot of the statue of Maimonides, you will inherit his great wisdom. So, you know, that's why you get these crowds of people. I have to say, many years ago, my wife, who's a retired academic, went to Cordova for a conference. And she, together with many other naive tourists, lined up to touch the foot of Maimonides. But I have to tell you, when she came back home, I certainly noticed no difference at all. So it certainly is in the realm of the legendary thing. But that really, that are the two vestiges of Almohad presence, right? But I mean, Maimonides was a boy when he left the city. Okay, let us move on a little further in the notes. And as I said, I'll come to the end of this soon and we'll stop for questions. What happens then is this is the end of the Muslim story. So we're done with that. And we now move on to the Christian story proper. And this is from 1886 to 1250. Sorry, not 1886, but 1086. Sorry, that is a typo. That should be 1086 to 1250. So what happens is this: after the fall of Toledo, the Almoravids were only able to stem the Christian advance temporarily, and the Almohads also enjoyed only temporary successes, and they were eventually defeated in the year of 1212 at a place called the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. Las Navas de Tolosa, very, very significant battle, because this really marks the beginning of the end finally, of a Muslim presence, except for Granada. Granada will basically remain standing. But that battle is a definitive one where the Almohads are forced basically out of the country. And really what you can say is that the Reconquista was virtually completed by the middle of the 13th century. So in 1236, you get the conquest of Cordoba. In 1248, you get the conquest of Seville. And really, with the conquest of Seville, you really reach the high point of the Reconquista. And the only one remaining outpost of Muslim rule is the Kingdom of Granada. Remember, I showed you that on the map a little bit earlier. So it's only Granada that basically remains to 1492. Okay, well, let me go on and say something something about Granada. I'm sorry, for some reason my camera keeps playing up on me, but that's why I just have to keep sort of shifting in and out of it. So talking about Granada, it's the last remaining Muslim outpost, and the group who take over there are a group known as Nasrids. They were sultans. It wasn't a caliphate, it was a sultanate. And the family was the family of the Nasrids, and they basically remained there till the fall of Granada to the Christians. And the last ruler of the Nasrids was a man called Muhammad XII. His nickname was Boabdil, and he was the last Nasrid ruler, and he basically surrendered to Castile and Aragon, Christian kingdoms, in 1492. There's a beautiful legend, there's a wonderful legend that as he was retreating into exile, he turned around to have one final distant look at Granada, and he sighed and he burst into tears. And his mother, betraying very little sympathy for her vanquished son, as I say in the notes, is said to have said to him, "You do well, my son, to cry like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." She certainly did not behave like a typical Jewish mother, right? Things. So certainly she put the boot in. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of this, I'm just going to bring up a couple of slides of this final Nasrid period. So what you have here, I mean, that's the map you can see. That's where Las Navas de Tolosa is. So you can see that, from Toledo in 1085, by 1212, they're down there. And that really, within a couple of decades, the Almohads are out, and then all that remains is that. But here is what you see. It's not even a vestige. You see the wonderful, wonderful presence of the Nasrids in Granada. They built the beautiful, beautiful Alhambra Palace. If you've been to Granada, you will no doubt have seen it. I mean, it's just magnificent. The gardens, the Lion Garden, the whole palace structure is just stunning, stunning, magnificent. So that really was the last gasp of, as magnificent as it was the last gasp of Muslim rule in Spain. And here, by the way, the next slide I'm going to show you is the capitulation of Granada. That's a sort of an artistic depiction, but that is our friend Boabdil, who was looking back and sighing and crying. And his mother says, what you couldn't, you cry over as like a woman, what you couldn't defend as a man. So that is essentially the depiction. It's a very, very seminal moment, of course, in Islamic history, because it marks the end of so many hundreds of years of Muslim rule in the country. So just going back finally to our notes, what we can say is that Jews under Nasrid rule did remain a visible and active element, but they were really unimportant. By that stage, the whole story of Jews under Muslim rule has become a real shadow of its former self. But interestingly, Granada even served as a refuge for Jews from the Christian North when things started to get bad for them in the Christian North. That's a long way off. It's a long way off because they go to the Christian North as a haven of refuge, but eventually things will turn sour for them. And some of them will actually go to Granada in the south under Muslim rule, where they will find a haven of refuge. But even that will not last long, because Granada, as you can see here in the notes, was conquered by the Christians in 1492, and its Jewish population was, of course, also subject to the decree of expulsion, as was the case in the rest of Spain. So let me stop here. That's the general background. We're going to, in a few minutes, or when we finish with questions and discussion, we're going to sort of say, so what did all this have to do with the Jews? How were the Jews affected by the Reconquista? So this is the general historical stuff. So let's see, Moshe, I gather you have a question.
Yeah, the Christian push back, was it really one central kingdom pushing back? Was it a league of kingdoms? And how involved was Rome in that?
Well, firstly, in answer to your first question, it's essentially, I mean, Spain really did not become a unified kingdom until 1492. With the expulsion, it's Ferdinand and Isabella who are the monarchs of Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella come from two different kingdoms. So it's a dynastic marriage, and they're the two largest kingdoms in Christian Spain. So when they come together, you can pretty well, sort of say that Spain is on the road to final unification. So it was a story of individual kingdoms involved in the story of the Reconquest, which is one of the reasons why it took so long. Because individual Christian kingdoms were sometimes, instead of getting their eye on the bigger game of getting the Muslims out, they sort of said, you know what, while we're at it, why don't we try and get some of the territory next door? So that was part of the problem here. They were at each other's throats and not just focusing on the big game. So it's a long drawn out story. Yeah.
And the involvement of Rome?
Not really. In a certain sense, you could say, this is really quite important. You could say that this Christian reconquest of Spain prefigures the great crusades that were initiated by the Pope. The Pope initiated the crusades in 1090 something, whatever, around about then. So the Spaniards were already fighting their own crusade for hundreds of years before Rome was involved in a crusade of this sort. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, Fran? Yes.
Where did the Nazarids come from?
Well, again, they were a sort of a family, an aristocratic family in Granada, right?
They were living there for some
yeah. They were living. You remember individual taifas and kingdoms. So when the Almoravids and Almohads came along, the taifas disappeared, but aristocratic, important families still retained a presence and were important. So when the Almohads were finally forced out, they were able to take advantage of that and regain power. It's actually very interesting that one of the main reasons, because it's an interesting question that one could ask, why, if the Reconquista was almost finished by 1250, why did Granada was able to hang out for another 150 years almost? The reason they did that is that they agreed. This is how treacherous the whole thing was. The Christian Spaniards were realizing that Seville was going to be a hard battle to fight, and we're going to see this in a few minutes. And they needed allies, so they actually approached the Nasrid family in Granada and said, if you back us against your Muslim brothers, we will guarantee that we will not touch you, right? But they were basically buying for time. I mean, ultimately, when Ferdinand and Isabella would come to the throne, she was a particularly Haredi version of a Catholic Christian. And they sort of said, you know what, let's just get the whole lot of them out of the country. So they basically bought time, but they basically stabbed their own Muslim brothers in the back as Seville was under attack by the Christians. That sort of explains why they really, in the end, became a vassal state. They had a sort of an independence, but they were really subject to the whims of Christian rulers and so on. But in that time, they still were able to build this magnificent Alhambra. That's what they left behind.
I was also questioning how equipped these two fundamentalist Berber tribes were to rule, because I assumed that Berber tribes coming from the Sahara, wherever they came from, were nomadic people.
Oh, no, they're North Africa. It's not just the Sahara. They were North Africa, Morocco, places like that. So they were a highly, they were far from Bedouin-like.
Okay.
They were a highly civilized culture and well advanced in all sorts of ways. Yeah. Okay. Any other? Yes.
That's Debbie. I seem to have lost my picture.
That's all right.
Were a lot of people killed in this? You know, the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews.
Yeah. I mean, it was a
Full-scale wars.
Yeah, it was a full-scale war. I mean, it lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. We're going to read in a minute the story of the capture of Seville. As I said, I'm normally not into military history, but the story of the capture of Seville is so dramatic. It is just really worth reading, especially when it's written by a really, really good historian who really plays up the battle scene. You know, really, really nice. But you'll get a feel for what the battle was like, in a sense. Any other questions or thoughts before we move on? Okay. So let us go back to our notes, and we're going to move to the top of page 3. And this is, as I said, the dramatic story of the capture of Seville. This comes from a book. I've given you the title of the book at the end of this extract, a book by Chris Loney. And it's a beautiful book because what it actually does is it focuses on the story, the comparative story of Jews and Muslims and Christians in medieval Spain. So if you want to get that sort of bigger picture, because the problem is a lot of books you get is it's the history of Christian Spain, it's history of Jews in Spain. But she actually beautifully manages to bring together the stories of the 3 different cultures. And she does it through a series of portraits. Each chapter is a portrait of a person or a place or an incident of some sort. And in this particular case, she actually describes for us the capture of Seville. It is really a really dramatic quiet story. So Roz, are you up for a bit of reading for us? If you want to unmute. Okay, over to you. Ferdinand III.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Okay. Ferdinand III, this greatest of Spain's crusader kings, conquered Al-Andalus' crown jewels, cities of Cordoba and Seville, while whittling Muslim Spain's territory to one embattled province surrounding Granada. The centuries-long reconquest had sapped Muslim Spain's defences and shaken her political will. Once Al-Andalus did Christian Spain the favour of splintering into petty principalities. Christian princes secured their diminutive kingdoms in the north, then clawed back the chunks of largely empty and worthless frontier, and finally reclaimed Muslim Spain's heartland. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, 1212, is generally considered the engagement that once and for all shattered Muslim Spain's capacity to resist. 2 decades drifted by before Christian Spain raised in Fernando a military leader resolved and aggressive enough to press home its advantage. Fernando captured Cordoba in 1236, liberating Santiago de Compostela's cathedral bells from 230 years of forced service as lamp fixtures in Cordoba's Grand Mosque. Whereas the then Muslim ruler Almanzar had abandoned a cold and damp Santiago de Compostela after looting what little of value he found there, Fernando had no intention of abandoning a Cordoba that was, after all, as fine a city as any in his kingdom. He expelled its Muslim populace, rechristened its mosque, the Mesquita, as a cathedral, and began recruiting Christian immigrants to resettle the city.
Okay, so stop there for a minute. We're going to go on because I want to sort of share with you some slides, some really quite dramatic slides that relate to the reconquest of Cordoba, and then I'll get you to continue reading about Seville. So let's have a look and see what happens when Ferdinand III comes into Cordoba, and this is what you can see. So firstly, here is a depiction of the fall of the city. As you can see, Ferdinand III, and the Muslim rulers pay obeisance to the Christian armies. But Ros read that thing about the bells of Compostela from the Church of Compostela de Santiago. Now, Compostela de Santiago is in the very, very, very north of the country. Remember I showed you Covadonga? So the Muslims actually managed to get as far as that, and what they actually did is they temporarily were successful in that part of the country, and they actually took away the bell from the bell tower and schlepped it all the way down to Cordoba. Can you imagine? I mean, this is symbolic. And they basically hung it in, turned it into a lamp and hung it in their own mosque. So that's essentially the Christians bringing this thing back into
the Muslims.
No, the Christians bringing it back to Santiago de Compostela. This is Ferdinand recapturing the bell and sort of taking it all, because that's the Mesquita, right? It's being taken back and taken back to the Christian north. And by the way, that's a thing that appears in school textbooks. You can see that the Reconquista is big time stuff in Spanish schools. Now here is what's absolutely amazing. You remember this map that I showed you of the original Mesquita? Abd Rahman I had come in and started stage 1, and then they added on, and then someone else added on, and then finally Almanzor expanded or doubled almost the area of the thing. Now Ferdinand III enters the city in 1236, and he walks into the Mesquita, and you remember I showed you pictures of it. It's magnificent. Now, what does a Christian conqueror do? I mean, he's a conqueror, and you would expect that as a mark of conquest, you're going to sort of like totally destroy this place. I mean, that's what conquerors do. Like, it's good to be the king. I can go around and do whatever I want, and I can destroy the whole place. So you would have thought that this is exactly what he would do, but no. We know one thing about Ferdinand III. He had a reputation for being something of an aesthete. He really appreciated beauty and great architecture. And it seems that he just could not bring himself to tear this down. It was just one of the great wonders of the ancient world. He couldn't do this. So what does he do instead? In the middle of this great Mesquita, he erects a cathedral, right? And when you actually go to the Mesquita today, it's like walking through a time warp. You actually walk through these Muslim arches, just like back all the time, and all of a sudden, when you look up, the whole thing changes. You are looking up at the roof of a Christian cathedral, right? That was the work of Ferdinand III, and that's exactly inside this huge mosque is this huge cathedral, right? So that was Ferdinand III as conqueror. That's how he basically left his mark on the city. So that's Ferdinand. And I'm just going to share this other photo with you. It's very contemporary. It's got nothing to do with the history. But when I was, as I told you, I've been running tours to Spain for about 7 or 8 years. And I ran my first tour of Spain in 2010. But what I did is I went to Spain with one of my daughters, my older daughter, Rebecca, and we actually mapped out the tour, because Spain is not blessed with a lot of tour operators who really know the Jewish story. So, I sort of mapped out the tour with her. And this was December, by the way. This was in December. We were in Cordoba. And it was late afternoon. and I was walking past, this is the outside of the Mesquita. I was walking past and I saw this little guy on his knees and I stopped. And what there is, remember, this is now a cathedral because it'd been this is a Muslim prayer mat. This is a Muslim man at the time of prayer on his prayer mat. And I love this scene because it was almost like saying, you know what, you Christians, up yours. This was once ours. I am here. And one day we're going to probably get it back from you, right? I just love the photo because for me, it symbolized the whole sort of notion of reconquest and what it meant for Muslims and so on. In fact, often when I walk through the Mesquita, you actually see Muslims often coming in to visit what is now a cathedral and a church. And I often wonder how they feel about this great wonder that was once theirs and now is no longer theirs. So that's just a little bit about Cordoba. So let us move on, Rosin, keep reading now about the capture of Seville, which is the far more dramatic story to tell. So a decade or so later, if you keep reading from there.
A decade or so later, Fernando turned his attention to Seville, among Spain's and Europe's most populous, affluent cities. Its 100,000 inhabitants were sheltered by an extensive network of walls and moats. The Guadalquivir River, the ocean outlet that won Seville's prosperity as a trading depot, became in war the watery lifeline to the outside world that greatly complicated Fernando's siege plans. Late medieval warfare could be a long drawn-out enterprise, steeped in what modern warriors antiseptically called collateral damage. Simply put, the technology for erecting strong walls had outpaced the technology for knocking them down. Hunkered down in their protective cocoon, besieged inhabitants could survive indefinitely, provided, of course, they had food and water. By the summer of 1247, Fernando had sealed the land routes into Seville and blockaded its river link to the outside world, giving its inhabitants, as one Muslim chronicler put it, their first taste of disaster. Civilians struggled to break the siege, floating burning barges down the Guadalquivir in the hopes of immolating the blockading ships. Nighttime patrols sneaked outside the city walls to scavenge food in fields that Fernando's crusaders had scorched barren. Civilians were slowly starving, while Fernando's 6,000 or 7,000 besiegers, according to one Christian chronicler, patiently maintained their vigil from a camp that had the appearance of a great city, noble and very rich, served by rag and bone dealers and money changers, grocers and apothecaries, armourers and bridal sellers, butchers and fishermen, and so on, for every need that can exist in the world. Fernando's armies futilely pounded stone walls that proved far sturdier than the flesh and blood humans cowering within. After failing to penetrate Seville's defences, they catapulted stones and flaming debris into the city proper, destroying all amenities, both small and great, except what was in the houses of a few rich people. With the advent of sophisticated modern weaponry, the catapult may seem a tinker toy that amuses little boys, yet terrifies no one, but medieval catapults could lob some 200 pounds of material the length of a football field, showering towns with bombardment, both terrifying and damaging. Well aware that the warfare is psychological no less than physical, Christian armies occasionally launched the severed head of a Muslim captive into the midst of a besieged town. Seville's inhabitants were too hunger crazed to appreciate the irony that the same defensive walls that sealed out Fernando's armies were effectively guaranteeing their own starvation within. They staggered around like drunkards, even though they weren't drunk, the chronicler continued, resigning any hope of corn or barley. The people began to chew animal skins. Squeezed in the grip of the enemies of God, anguished civilians appealed to Muslims North Africa, bewailing the terrible struggle and the severe, excruciating distress that had taken over them. North African Almoravids and Almohads had rallied more than one jihad to deliver Muslim Spain from previous crises, but this time an Almohad dynasty on the verge of collapse was too preoccupied with its own worries, nor was help forthcoming from elsewhere in Al-Andalus. Indeed, the besieging armies camped outside Seville's walls included a 500-strong contingent from Muslim Granada, dispatched by its emir. Nearly 18 months passed before Seville's magistrates bowed to the inevitable and negotiated surrender terms. Suffice it is to say that their bargaining position was by that point weak. Fernando allowed civilians 1 month to depart from whatever they could carry, with whatever they could carry. An emaciated populace barely able to stand wasn't about to carry much. Most sold what they could at distressed prices. Who was there to buy? Before staggering forth, many joined a waiting convoy that sailed to North Africa. Others trekked the 100-odd miles to Granada, now the last remaining principality of size in Muslim hands. Ironically, they were taking refuge in a kingdom lorded over by the same Granadan emir who had helped starve them out of Seville. King Fernando and his retinue entered a deserted Seville a few days later, taking possession of well-constructed but empty residences and shops, a stage set on which Christian immigrants would try to recreate what had been one of Europe's most populous and prosperous cities. They began by rechristening it, its central mosque, as a cathedral.
Okay, I mean, you can see why I wanted to share this. It's such a dramatic story. It's such a great sort of narrative. And I mean, someone asked me before a little bit about what was the war, what were these wars like? I don't know who asked the question, but it doesn't matter. But, you know, I think this description gives you a feel of what the Christian reconquest would have been like, particularly as the armies began to advance in the terror. Now, you see, one of the things that's interesting is when I remember when I first read this, you know, particularly this thing about the 18-month siege and so on and so on. One of the things it sort of reminded me of, there was a sort of an echo, it reminded me of the Roman capture and siege of Jerusalem in the year of 70. Because what actually had happened is that the Jews had basically holed themselves up in the city, and the Romans in the Jewish-Roman War had laid siege to the city, and the siege actually continued for a period of a couple of years. And the circumstances were not all that dissimilar. They actually ended up basically starving them, right? There was not, you know, they couldn't get, because they were up there, the Romans were down here, and so on and so on. And it's really interesting because when that sort of image came to my mind, and I actually started doing some research, because, you know, my tours are study tours and we do teaching, I came across this incredible poem, which I'm just going to share with a small section of it. And it's a lament for this fall of Seville. It's a Muslim lament. And it reminded me of that beautiful, beautiful lament that you find by the waters of Babylon. We sat down and wept for thee, O Zion. In other words, you have these exiles who have just lost their city. They're exiled to Babylon and they weep. They cry for the lost city of Jerusalem. We wept. And this Muslim lament is just wonderful. It evokes a similar thing, and taken from a poem written, you know, a few decades after the fall of the city. And he writes and says, the evil eye has struck Al-Andalus in its Islam, so that the land decreased until whole regions and districts were despoiled of the faith. Therefore, ask Valencia, what is the state of Murcia? And where is Khativa? Where is Jaén? Where is Cordova, the home of the sciences and many a scholar whose rank once lofty in it? Where is Seville and the pleasures it contains, as well as its sweet river, overflowing and brimming full? Capitals, which were the pillars of the land, yet when the pillars are gone, it may no longer endure. The tap of the white ablution fount weeps in despair, like a passionate lover weeping at the departure of the beloved. over dwellings emptied of Islam that were first vacated and are now inhabited by unbelief, that is, of course, Christianity, in which the mosques have become churches wherein only bells and crosses may be found. Even the mihrabs weep, they are solid. The mihrab is the central place of prayer in a mosque. It's a bit like the equivalent of the Aron HaKodesh, the central place of the mosque. Even the mihrabs weep, even though they are solid. And even the pulpits mourn, even though they are wooden. O you who remain heedless, though you have a warning in fate, if you are asleep, fate is always awake. And you who walk forth cheerfully, while your homeland diverts you from cares, can a homeland beguile any man after the loss of Seville? I mean, you can really feel the pain. You can really, because this is a fairly contemporaneous sort of account. You can really feel the pain of this Muslim mourning over the fall of this great city of Seville. It was one of the great kingdoms in the Taifa period. And again, let me just share with you some slides relating to the Seville story. Let me just do that. And so what have we got here? Okay, so there you have in the Prado Museum, the great central museum of Spain, you actually have a very, very famous photo of the surrender of Seville to the Christian forces, right? So it just shows you how important, and that is basically the mosque. The cathedral that was erected by Ferdinand III, right? Now notice, what he did is he ripped down the mosque that had been built there. I'm not sure whether it was not as beautiful as the one in Cordova. It may very well have been. Probably that was the case, because the Almohads were renowned for a much, much more austere form of architecture. They did not elaborate their architecture in the way that the previous caliphate had done Cordova. So probably Ferdinand walked in and looked around and said, not worth it. Might as well just tear the whole place down and build something more magnificent. And in fact, he did. The Seville Cathedral is the third largest cathedral in the whole world. It is, I don't know if you've been in there, but it is huge. Amongst other things, you will find the tomb of Christopher Columbus. Magnificent, magnificent tomb. I actually took a photo of it because I said to my wife, when I get buried, I want to have one of those as well. It's truly, truly stunning. But look what he did. He left behind the one remnant of the great mosque, that is the Giralda Tower. But what was his sign of conquest? On top of the tower, he puts a Christian bell tower. Like, finally, we are here. So that was the way he was going to mark the conquest. He was going to leave something to remind people that he had conquered the Almohads and had driven them out of the country. So that's the reconquest of Seville. So let me just, we're going to come back to this a little later. So very, very quickly, because we're focused on Cordova and Seville, if anyone's got any questions, comments, I'll take them, but if not, we're going to sort of move on and talk about the Jews in the period of the Reconquista, because we've pretty much dealt with general history. So if you've got any more questions about the general stuff, I'll entertain them. If not, we'll move on to the Jewish story. Okay, so let's move on in your notes to the section that deals with the Jews of Christian Spain, and I've entitled this A Tale of the Best of Times and the Worst of Times, with apologies to Charles Dickens, of course, but nevertheless, I think it's one of those beautiful phrases that captures the thing. It was a tale of the best of times and the worst of times. So really, the few dot points that I've enunciated here really, in a certain sense, summarize for you how Jews actually fared under Christian rule. You remember I said to you before that many Jews fled from the persecutions of the Muslim South and fled to the Christian North because, in fact, they were welcomed. Now, why they were welcomed, to understand that, you actually have to go to the story of the Reconquista. That's what helps explain that. So, Sue, would you like to unmute for us and just take us through that relatively short summary of the story of the Jews, at least in the best of times, under Christian rule.
Jews or Christians in Spain, a tale of the best of times and worst of times. Best of times. The need for settlers in newly reconquered Christian territories boded well for Jews. They were employed as royal financiers, treasurers, administrators, diplomats, and interpreters. It was then due to their knowledge of Arabic and familiarity with the conditions in Muslim Spain, their neutrality and their reliability, more so than Christian nobles and clerics. Jews were permitted to retain their own quarters and property. Jewish communities, al-Khamas, enjoyed extensive autonomy. They integrated well into the fabric of Spanish Christian society and distinguished themselves in varied intellectual, occupational, and commercial pursuits. Despite the efforts of the church to prevent the growing influence of the Jews, the Jewish contribution in the period of Reconquista was greatly valued by Christian kings and was deeply rooted in the historical consciousness of the royal family, Assis. More repressive anti-Jewish policies introduced by the church in other parts of Europe, e.g. distinguishing dress, were ignored by Spanish rulers. The largest numbers of Jews who migrated to the Christian north ended up in Toledo, ranked along the greatest of Spain's Jewish communities for its cultural innovation and achievement. There was a growth in Jewish prestige and intellectual life, especially under Alfonso X, his son and grandson. He establishes a school of translators to work on translating Arabic and Hebrew documents into Castilian and Latin. However, this same Alfonso, the son of Ferdinand the Great, incorporated a number of highly repressive members against the Jews in his great 13th century law code, La Siete Partidas, although these were not implemented until mid-14th century. Toledo best represented the convivencia that characterized the Reconquista period, though, as Thomas Glick notes, the word carries connotations of mutual interpenetration and creative influence, even as it also embraces the phenomena of mutual friction, rivalry, and suspicion. Glick. Jewish
So,
sorry,
yeah,
go on.
Yeah, so thanks for that. So that sort of very briefly sort of summarizes the story. So one important theme to keep in mind here is a comparative one. You remember when the Muslims entered Spain in 711, the Jews welcomed them with open arms. And not only that, but the Muslims welcomed the Jews with open arms as well. Why did the Jews welcome them? Because they had been oppressed by the previous Visigoth kingdom, right? So a similar story here. The Jews are escaping, finding havens of refuge in the Christian north, especially Toledo, because they're suffering persecution at the hands of Muslims. Why are the Christians welcoming them? Because they're fighting a war and they need allies on the ground. And certainly the allies on the ground weren't going to be the Muslims. They were fighting against them. So the other large dominant population on the ground were Jews. They weren't necessarily going to take part in the fighting, but they would be allies on the ground. They could secure them in administrative roles, in financial roles, and all sorts of things. And that is the main reason why in what we would call the best of times under Christian rule, the Jews actually enjoyed a position of considerable success and authority. And I know we talk about the golden age of Jews under Muslim rule. As one scholar has sort of said, if they didn't enjoy a golden age under Christians, it was certainly a silver age, right? It was still a thing. But as Thomas Glick, the quote that Sue read at the very end, it's very important to understand. It was never, ever a bed of roses. Just because they were doing well, right, they still suffered the brunt of Christian anti-Semitism at the same time. So you've got to think of Jewish life under Muslim rule and Jewish life under Christian rule as well as a story which is a double-edged sword, right? There's one side of it that is good and there's one side of it that carries discrimination and other things. So we should never ever get carried away with some fanciful notion that this was some utopian sort of ideal. Now, the way I want to expand on the story of the Christian Reconquest period is I want to actually take you on quite a sort of a virtual tour of Spain and show you where in Spain today you would locate the various sites of that connect to the Christian Reconquest story. Now, it's not as though you walk around Spain and there's a sign here that says, you know, Reconquest stop #1, you know, Jewish tour. You got to know where to go with these things. It's sort of all over the place. But I'm going to sort of give you a feel for where you will find that Jewish story embedded in the context of contemporary Spain. So there's quite a number of slides I'm going to share with you. And then I'll open it up for discussion based on what you see and whatever have you. So let us go back to the city of Toledo, because of course that was the beginning, the moment when the Reconquista really gets underway. And you remember I said to you that this was the place where many, many Jews fled, especially when the Almoravids and Almohads entered Andalusia. So by 1085, you actually start to get Jews coming into the city. Now, I've already, I mean, that's another view of Toledo overlooking the Great River. Now, I've already mentioned to you the statue. Remember, we saw the statue coming in. Now, that statue, the location of it is actually a traffic roundabout. So as you come into the city, there's a huge, huge traffic roundabout, and the statue is mounted on this sort of huge block, and there are wings. 4 wings, 3 or 4 wings around the statue. And you can only barely make it out. But on that particular wing, I actually get the bus driver. He thinks I'm the greatest pain because I actually get him to do 2 circuits of the roundabout in a big bus, because I want people to actually see what's on the traffic roundabout. And on one side, you actually see Arabic script. Right? There's an inscription in Arabic on one side of the statue. Now, here's the amazing thing. On the other side of the statue, opposite there, you see Hebrew script, right? There are 3 languages. There's Castilian, which is Spanish, of course. There's Hebrew, and there is Arabic. You see that on one side of the statue. So that's what Yefei Nof Mesos Tevel. Now, I will translate that in a moment. This is what it says. So that's the actual inscription, and it reads, "Beautiful heights, joy of the world, city of a great king, far from the west, my soul yearns for you." And then that's the inscription, the 2 lines. And then that's actually taken from a poem by Yehuda Halevi. I think I mentioned Yehuda Halevi in the Muslim story, and he was a great poet. Remember I said to you, and he wrote a poet glorifying the city of, obviously, Jerusalem, when he talks about city of your great king, etc., etc. So that's what you actually see. Now, when I'm with my tour group, I make a particular point after we have come into the city and looked at the statue of Alfonso. I then get the bus driver to take you to what is without question the best place to view Toledo in terms of the panoramic view, and that's what you see. And when we get to the top, I actually read the poem by Yehuda Halevi. And what's really interesting here is that Halevi wrote this poem, and it was about the city of Jerusalem. But he'd never been to Eretz Yisrael. It's not as though there were tours every week leaving from Spain where you could just hop on a boat and go and visit and come back. He'd never been to Eretz Yisrael. And he's writing here a poem, trying to imagine in his head what a city of a great king would look like. I mean, the reference, of course, is to the great King David, who was already long and dead and buried. I suspect that he took as his template the great city of Toledo. He actually was born in Toledo. He grew up there. He left there when he was about 18 or 20. And I suspect that that's what must have been the case. Because the question I pose to people as we stand here is I say, like, when you have to imagine a place, how do you actually imagine that place when you've never actually seen it? Now, what I think is really, really interesting is that, firstly, most tourists would not even notice this roundabout. If they see the statue, they wouldn't even notice the inscription around. So it would just be like whoopee, and they just move on. But if you did, and you were a little bit curious and you were to ask, like, what is that? And someone might translate it, you know, Fenov, by the way, this was the municipality. This is a 20th century construction. When they erected the statue, they wanted to honor Alfonso in a particular way. So they took this quote out of Yehuda Halevi. But if you're an unsuspecting tourist, you would think that Halevi was writing about Toledo, not Jerusalem. So it's like appropriating this poetry, a city of a great king, right? So so that's Alfonso. So that's the way, and I think it's very significant that the city wanted to honor Alfonso in a way that clearly indicated something about his character. And the fact that they chose to have 3 inscriptions, even though Alfonso had conquered the city from the Muslims, the other side of Alfonso was a king who greatly valued the meeting of minds. And he actually encouraged Muslim and Jewish scholars to come to the city of Toledo. Remember, you know, Sue had read before about the School of Translation that was set up there. So that's captured in that particular thing. And that's the city. Now, in Toledo itself, there is in fact some incredible vestige of Jewish influence and affluence. And what you see in Toledo today, it's hard to see here. Today it is Museo El Greco, because El Greco, the famous painter, was born in Toledo, and that's where he actually lived. But before he lived there, this place was actually built by a very wealthy Jew by the name of Samuel Halevi Abulafia. That was his palace. He built this for himself, right? Very wealthy Jew. Now, for those of you who have been to Toledo, you might not be so familiar with that, but you might remember this entrance, because what this entrance takes you into is this magnificent synagogue, right? It's called the El Transito. It doesn't sound very Jewish, El Transito. And we'll get to that a little bit later, in a later time, because eventually the synagogue after 1492, of course, became a church, right? That's why it's called still, but it's a museum today. But just look at this magnificent architecture. And it is the personal synagogue of Samuel Halevi Abulafia. Can you imagine how loaded this guy was to have his like personal synagogue, and he could like invite his mates in for Shabbos, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so this was, so you can, and sort of, a lot of people sort of say that next to the king in Toledo, he was probably the wealthiest person around. And he was, by the way, the personal advisor to the king, a financial advisor as well. So that gives you a sense of Jews in the Reconquista period, how well they were doing. When you go to Cordova, by the time you get to 14th century Cordova, most Jews have left the city because the Almohads took care of that. Remember, Maimonides lived in the city and he actually left. Most of the Jews had left, but there were a number of Jews who returned, a small number, and again built this gorgeous little synagogue. I mean, that's the size of it. I mean, there's no more rooms. There's the women's gallery, of course, upstairs, but that's essentially the size of it. But still, to be able to build a synagogue of this quality would tell you something about the prosperity of a small Jewish community living under Christian rule. Now, here's the one that takes the cake. Remember we read about the capture of Seville by Fernando III. He's like, he brings the Reconquista to an end, effectively, because there's only Granada after that. Inside the cathedral of Seville, you will find the tomb of and when you get to the tomb of Ferdinand, Ferdinand III, I'm sorry, I've just, what have I done here? Okay, so when you get to the tomb of Ferdinand III, what actually, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, it's fine, okay. So when you get to the tomb of Ferdinand III, there's another really interesting thing that happens. You've got on the opposite side, you've got a Castilian and Latin inscription, and on this side, you've got an Arabic and a Hebrew inscription. Now, what is that telling you? Again, that this is a king who, as much as he was the conqueror of that city of Seville, we read this terrible, terrible city of conquest, he still, once he conquered the city, greatly valued the intercultural, interfaith type of penetration, right? This was built a generation after him. This was not built in the 20th century. That's his tomb. And the tomb was actually erected by his son, Alfonso X, right? So it tells you something about, and this is the great thing. When you go inside the cathedral, that's the treasury room of the cathedral. So it's where they keep all the gold and the silver. And one of the things, a lot of people miss this, they don't know about this even, there's a case, a lock case, and there's a key. And when you actually, it's hard to see it here, there's actually Hebrew writing, right? And it says in Hebrew, the King of Kings will open and the kings of earth will appear. The King of Kings meaning God will open the gates of the city and the King of Earth, Ferdinand, will enter the city. What were these keys? They were the symbolic gates of the city that the Jews gave to Ferdinand as he entered the city, right? What is that telling you? The Jews welcomed him with open arms. They saw this as an opportunity to thrive and to develop. And indeed, they had done so since they had come to Toledo, at least a century earlier. Now, one of the things that happens when Seville is conquered, one of the things that Ferdinand does, he wants to show his appreciation to the local Jewish community, right? So one of the things that he does is he takes one of the local mosques and he hands it over to the Jews and says, look, as a reward for your loyalty and whatever have you, I'm going to give this to you and you can turn it into a synagogue. So today in Seville, not to be confused with the one in Toledo, there's a Santa Maria la Blanca in Toledo, but today in Seville, you have the Church of Santa Maria la Blanca. And there's an entrance to this church which is locked. And the priests don't like opening this. You've got to know that it's there. It's sort of locked from public view. But the guy that I always work with in Seville knows of its presence, and he actually got us in. And what you actually see is that this was once, in fact, the mosque, once a mosque, that then became a synagogue. Today it's a church. When you walk into that church today, you can't see anything of it being a synagogue. But when they were doing renovations, I think it was in around about the year of 2000, they were renovating a section of the church. They actually uncovered what were the typical synagogue architecture type walls and so on and so on. So this was a mosque that became a synagogue under Christian rule. So it tells you something about the status of Jews in this particular period. And then you come to a place called Avila. I don't know how many people go to Avila. It's sort of a bit off the, it's a very, very important Christian city. A woman by the name of Santa Teresa of Avila, she was a very important Christian mystic, was born in Avila. That's why it's a place of pilgrimage. And this is what it looks like. It's fairy tale stuff. When you come in the bus, I mean, this is not like Disneyland. This is real. This is a completely preserved medieval wall, ancient. The whole city surrounded by this wall. It's just stunning when you come and see it. But importantly, Avila was a very, very important center of Jewish life in the Reconquista period, right? In the Reconquista. That was a former synagogue. That was a former synagogue. This hostel, Hospederia, is called La Sinagoga because it previously, in the medieval period, was the site of a synagogue. And there's still some evidence of that today. So sort of Hospederia, so you see signs of that. But very, very amazingly, in Avila, you come across a street called Cal de Moses de Leon. Now, who was Moses de Leon? Moses de Leon was fundamentally the author of the Zohar. What was the Zohar? The Zohar was the foundational text of Kabbalah. You've all heard of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and the foundational textbook of Kabbalah is the Zohar. And he spent the latter years of his life, he was born in another place called Guadalajara, but came at a later point to Avila and settled there And that's where it's believed he basically completed the Kabbalah, the Zohar, right? And you've got a whole street named after him. There's a whole memorial garden, right? We actually sit there and we read some texts and so on and so on and so on. And there's even a memorial plaque there with a quote from the Zohar itself, right? I mean, folks, it's important to understand these are modern things, but the modern municipalities, when they're going back into their history, are recognizing that there was a time when Jews actually thrived under Christian rule. When, yes, it wasn't a bed of roses, but they were doing very nicely. And similarly, when you go to Barcelona, the old Jewish quarter of Barcelona, there's nothing to see there. I mean, it's a beautiful old quarter, the old Jewish quarter, but there's nothing left almost. I was lucky enough in a particular year when I took a group that they had an exhibition at this particular museum, the Historical Museum of Barcelona, Museo de Historia. And in that particular year, I was just lucky. They actually had, it was the year of 2010, because it was the anniversary or whatever, 700 years, whatever, of the death of Shlomo ben Adret, Shlomo ibn Adret, who was a leading rabbi and scholar in the city of Barcelona, whose reputation was worldwide. He was a major scholar of halakha. I'm so glad I took this shot because it was a temporary exhibition, and it's the only thing that I really can show of the once important place that Barcelona had in this Reconquista period. And finally, we come to Girona. Girona, which is a gorgeous, I mean, look at this, it's just drop dead gorgeous to go into that's the old Jewish quarter of Girona, right? That's what it looks like. And they actually have an amazing museum of medieval Jewish history there. It is stunning museum. And just one of the things on the wall just gives you a list of people who lived in this part of the world. In this northern part of the world, Barcelona, but look, an astronomer, a mathematician, a translator, a Talmudist, a philosopher, a translator, a literary scholar, Kabbalist, and the most famous Jew of all, Ramban, not Rambam, to be confused with Talmudists, but Nachmanides, Moses ben Nachmanides, a Talmudist, a biblical commentator, and a Kabbalist. And he is like the famous native son of Girona, all right? So that gives you a little bit of a visual feel of what the best of times was actually like. So let me stop here and see if you've got any questions or comments or thoughts about this, the best of times. So I could have done this through text, but because I've got visual stuff, it was just an opportunity to sort of showcase some of this material. So, but you may have questions because the pictures only take you so far, but I'm happy to sort of questions if you have any.
Paul, we can't see you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay, there I am, I'm back again. For some reason, my camera keeps playing up, but thank you. Okay. Any questions? Any comments, thoughts about what we've seen, what I've said? Yeah, Stephen, would you like to?
When we were both there, you showed us a very famous debate between, I think it was Nachmanides and it was a Jewish apostate.
That's next week.
That's next week, okay.
That's the worst of times.
Yes.
That's the worst of times. Tonight we're on the best of times. Next week, this is as good as it gets. This is as good as it gets. From next week on, it's all downhill, right? It gets pretty bleak. Okay, Sue, did you have a question?
No, when we went to Girona with kids, there in the museum there is still the mikveh.
Yeah, they still have a mikveh there and so on.
Mm.
The woman who runs that museum, by the way, she is absolutely amazing. She's the director of the museum, and she's a scholar. She's a Christian woman, and she's actually a scholar, and she has devoted her whole life to uncovering the life of the Jews in that part of the country. What's that part of the country called again? They're always wanting to get independence.
The Basque.
Yeah, not the Basque. It's the someone's going to remember this. You know, there's all these protests always whenever they have elections or whatever. Anyway,
Catalonia.
thank you, Catalonia. So she's devoted a whole life basically to uncovering the story of the Jews in Catalonia. She's a non-Jew, right? And her specialism is the women of medieval Girona. She's written a number of beautiful monographs on that. And I remember when I actually first met her in 2008 when I was there with my daughter Rebecca, and Rebecca at the time had just been appointed to the director of the Jewish Museum, and I knew there was a museum in Girona, and we went there, and then I saw a little away from the museum on the staircase it said Nachmanides Research Institute, and I thought, hello, this is interesting. What's all that about? So I went up the stairs and I see this woman sitting there. I introduced myself. It's just the secretary. I said, I'd like to speak to the director. So we're sitting there waiting, and lo and behold, on the table was the latest journal published by the Jewish Museum of Australia. Because, you know, museums do that. They exchange stuff. And Rebecca was like so incredibly excited, like, we're sitting here, we're going to meet this. And that was my first meeting with this woman. And we just developed a love affair over the next 8 years. She's just stunning. But when I asked her, you know, why is it that you, a non-Jew living in Spain, are so invested in the story? She said, because that story is my story. It's not someone else's story. She said they left in 1492, but that's a hole that I feel. That's part of my narrative. And that's why she's just devoted the whole life to uncovering this. By the way, you come across some of these remarkable individuals in my travels. I mean, I found some of them in Spain, but also, by the way, in Poland. In Poland, there are some incredible people who say similar things, that they are so invested in the Jewish story because they feel this hole, they feel this emptiness, etc. So anyway, yes, David, and then Rosalind, yeah.
Why is there a very high level of anti-Semitism then in Spain?
Yeah, so you got to hold your hat a little bit, because we're going to talk about the worst of times. Now, I don't want to suggest for a moment, because this is really important. I don't want to suggest for a moment that part one today, best of times, it was like beautiful and nobody hated Jews, and then all of a sudden one day in 1391, because that's a definitive year, one day on January 1st, 1391, somebody woke up and said, oh, I think we can just start hating Jews. Like, we've loved them for 200 years, now we can start hating them. The seeds of that anti-Jewish feeling were already being sown in this period. Because you've got to remember that one of the eternal motifs of Jewish history, often in the medieval period, is when Jews are starting to fare very, very well, therein lie the seeds of their own destruction as well, right? You know, Christian jealousy, all of the sorts of things as well. So this is the best of times. Within the best of times, the seeds are being sown for the worst of time. But we will pick up on that next week, David. You want to hear anti-Semitism? You'll get a load full of it next week. All right. I know Jews say, like, what's a talk without anti-Semitism? Like, you know, so you'll get an earful of it next week. Okay, yes, Rosalind, go ahead.
We did a brief impromptu tour of Spain with an Israeli guide who was pretty hopeless, or even worse than that.
Should have come with me. See, there you go.
Should have.
Yeah,
yes.
Well.
It was pretty spur of the moment from Israel. Anyway, when we were in Cordova, one of the best things about the tour was that they organised a local tour guide to take us to the sites in Cordova. And when we were in the La Sinagoga that you showed us a photo of, the guide, Maria, the highlight of my tour was this little experience with the guide, because while we were standing there in the shul, the hopeless Israeli guide told us a little bit about her story. Her name was Sigalit, and she's Sephardi, and she mentioned that her family fled Spain and went to Bulgaria. As she described her family's story, the guide was so taken aback and fighting back the tears. It was almost like we'd come across this secret, this woman who maybe suspected that she was perhaps, she just was very curious about her past, obviously. And she went on to say that to this day, she argues the history with her parents. So she's obviously struggling, and perhaps that's why she's taken on the role of a guide. And just came to me when you said that you have these experiences in Spain, and just watching her reaction to Sigalit's story was amazing.
Okay, we're going to devote a whole session, by the way, to the story of the conversos. The conversos, of course, were the Jews who actually converted for a variety of reasons, but we're going to devote a whole, because, you know, you can't talk about the Jewish story of Spain and not talk about the conversos. You know, it's a bit like that Monty Python scene in Fawlty Towers when he sort of tells everyone, you know, German tourists arriving, just don't mention the war. Remember that scene? So you can't talk about Spanish Jewish history and like pretend, oh, conversos, you know, they're very important, central part of the story. So, and I've got some amazing converso stories to share, but we will leave that for that later sort of period. Okay. All right. Anyone else? Judy? And then Moshe. Yep.
So did the community assimilate much? Did they live in ghettos? Did they intermarry? Like, what was Jewish life like?
Okay. That's a good question. So look, it was a very socially stratified society. I mean, as in any society, right? There were Jews who were very wealthy, upper class, and there was your everyday sort of hoi polloi doing all sorts of things and so on and so on. So the Jews who benefited most from this, you know, welcoming period of the Reconquista, of course, it goes without saying, I mean, it's a no-brainer, would have been the wealthy Jews who could contribute in different ways to Christian prosperity and so on. You know, other Jews fared well, but it was the upper classes of Jews who were more engaged at those sorts of levels. So, for example, in the intellectual class, it was the more educated, the more upper class Jews that interacted with Christians and so on and so on. You've got to remember that you can't really talk about, in a medieval context, you can't really talk about the problem of intermarriage, right? The notion of a Jew and a Christian just having an interfaith wedding, that wouldn't cut. The option was that you fell in love with a Christian. Well, basically, the only option was you're going to convert to Christianity, etc. Now, we're going to deal with the topic of conversos because Jews converted to Christianity in Spain for a variety of reasons and under a variety of circumstances. I know that we tend to associate this with the period of the Inquisition and so on, and it's true, that's the largest part of the story, but there were Jews who converted for reasons of conviction. There were Jews who actually convinced of the truth of Christianity and they converted as well, but we're going to deal with that in sort of sort of more detail. So no, there wasn't, but there was this thing. The Jews who were wealthy, who were from the aristocratic upper crust part of the community, were highly integrated into Christian society. I avoid the word assimilated because assimilated means you lose your identity completely, but they were highly integrated. The evidence seems to suggest that there was quite a bit of social mixing, right? And so on and so on. And it's interesting that when you get to the final expulsion of Spain, Jewish religious thinkers are trying to reflect on why has this tragedy befallen us. You know, Jews are very good at this. Jews are masters at trying to explain suffering. They've been doing it forever, right? And Jews in Spain wrote various tracts on why has this national tragedy befallen us. And it's interesting that one strand of thinking blamed the Jews who had lost their, not totally lost their identity, but had given up a lot of their piety, and they had begun to dabble with all of the, etc. So the fact that writers were thinking in those terms when after 1492 would indicate that, yes, to a certain degree, the upper class elements of the city, there was a loss of piety to some degree. So that's the answer. Okay. Now there was Moshe, I think you had your hand up.
I don't know if this is the appropriate space to make a comment about Teresa of Avila.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had suspected, but I just went to Google. I went to Wikipedia.
Yeah.
She was born in the early 1500s. Her grandfather was a Marrano or converso.
Converso, yeah.
Forced to convert. Juan, her father, was condemned by the Inquisition for allegedly returning to the Jewish faith.
Right.
But he was later able to assume a Catholic identity.
Right.
So yeah. So a very interesting piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's right. I mean, she was of Jewish origins, from a converso family, but she becomes like one of the great figures in the development of Christian mysticism. I mean, there's a church that is dedicated to Teresa of Avila, and it's like, I mean, it's a place of pilgrimage, basically.
Well, she's like another great Christian mystic.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in a sense. But by the way, it's very important to understand. You remember I talked about Moses de Leon?
Yeah.
Moses de Leon, Avila, center of mysticism.
Yeah.
Avila itself was not just the center of Christian mysticism, but it was a mystical city, right? Different cities in Spain at that time had reputations for different sort of things, and Avila was known to be the mystical city and the city of scholars. So that's important to appreciate. And I have no doubt that when Moses de Leon was in that city, he would have been interacting with other mystics in the place. But by the way, in Avila itself, there is, it hardly anyone knows about it, but there is a fantastic, it's very abstract. So it's not easy to find your way around or understand it, but there is in fact a museum of mysticism, right? And it embraces, Jewish, Islamic, and Christian mysticism. It's a bit of an interfaith project. It's just fantastic. I mean, if what's interesting about it is you take something abstract like mysticism, because it's as abstract as you could ever hope it to be, and try and turn it into a visual museum. It's quite a challenge, but they actually do quite a nice job of it. It's quite good. Yeah.
Just a thought.
Yeah, Moshe, and then someone else.
Yeah, just a thought on interfaith. Rambam's grandson Ovadia is treated by Sufis as a Sufi master.
Yeah. So absolutely, and that's one of the points I want to underline, that even though Jews, Christians, and Muslims were each other's enemies in a certain sense, at another level, at the meeting of minds, they could still come together, right? The fact that's the amazing sort of thing. That's the thing that's one of the, I think, one of the great paradoxes of the medieval Jewish story, particularly in Spain, right?
Paul, do you speak Spanish?
Not a word. Not a word. Not a word.
Do people speak English in Spain?
Yeah. It's pretty good. I mean, as I mostly. I mean, you can get around Spain pretty, but when you get into the smaller places, it can be a bit more challenging. But on the whole, yeah, it's really not a problem. It's not a problem. Yeah. Did someone, Ergard?
I find it fascinating how just in Barcelona, people are still talking about Castile and Aragon. It's just part of the everyday stories.
Yeah.
And in particular, when you talk to people that I spoke to people about, explain to me why this Catalonia wants to break away from Spain and so on. And so many times people made reference to what happened in 1492. These things seem to be deeply, deeply rooted in the everyday language.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's I mean, the Spaniards they're an amazing group of people. I mean, Spain is I would say, my favorite country. It's just, firstly, it's just a stunning place. I mean, I'm convinced that when Moses left Egypt and God gave him instructions to the promised land, I'm sure that Moses put in the wrong coordinates on his GPS, because I'm sure God must have said, go to the promised land, and meant Spain. And he did something and he ends up in the bloody desert and gets the Negev, because Spain is truly, like the Garden of Eden. It is, Spain and Italy, they're just like, that's just amazing. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so for the final bit, I'm going to actually just introduce the final bit. I'm going to leave it with you, because if you're interested, you can just keep reading on your own. It's self-explanatory material. So, all I would be doing is just getting people to read one paragraph and another, and we don't need to do that. It's getting on in time. So let me just introduce the final part of our discussion in your notes. And that is moving on from where it says Jewish legal status in Reconquista, Spain. So if you're there with me. So basically, through these slides, what I wanted to depict with you is give you a sense of sort of like the everyday life that Jews enjoyed in Spain. But there's a very, very important topic, and people have written books on it. I mean, standalone books on this, and that is the whole question of what was their legal status? What was their legal standing like? And this is really a really interesting question. And so just to get the introduction to this, let's read the first two paragraphs of that particular thing. And Serge, would you like to unmute and just read the first two paragraphs under Jewish legal status in Reconquista, Spain? If you can unmute. Yeah, thank you.
Jewish legal status in Reconquista, Spain. 1. Charters of the state. In contrast to the church, the states of medieval Western Christendom lacked impressive intellectual traditions. There was, in these states, no great sense of a rich heritage from the past, and no great drive towards the careful articulation of legal precedents and practices. Such law books as did develop did not normally treat extensively the position of the Jews. To the historian, the most useful materials for ascertaining the position of the state towards the Jews are the charters, occasionally extended to individual Jews, to specific Jewish settlements, or to the entire Jewish population of a given area. They remain useful for the insights they provide into the general position taken by the state towards the Jews. The charters address many diverse issues. Jews are recorded areas of a town in which to settle. The safety of their homes, synagogues, and cemeteries is guaranteed. Judicial prerogatives are granted. Business rights are specified. Religious freedoms are established. The right to self-government within the Jewish community is proclaimed. Unwarranted restriction on the Jews are prohibited. These grants reflect both the needs of the Jews and the commitment of their Christian overlords.
Okay, now that sort of summarizes the legal position. And you can sort of appreciate why this is so important, because everything I described in those slides, a relatively good way of life could only have happened when the Jews enjoyed a relatively positive legal status. And this is one of the really fascinating topics in the context of the medieval world, because you've got to understand that when we talk about Jewish legal status in the medieval world, there were different bodies of law that Jews were subject to, or that they were defined by different bodies of law. So, for example, there was what we call canon law, the law of the church. And the law of the church was a far cry from what Serge has just read, right? The law of the church relating to the Jews, because they did pass all sorts of regulations, was fundamentally driven by anti-Semitism. It was based on that whole thing about Jews as Christ killers and so on. So there was very, very little, very few redemptive elements in the law of the church. But when it came to the law of the state, Jews were under the protection of what we call royal charters. You see, one of the things that's important to understand is that when Jews started to come in relatively large numbers into the Christian north from the Muslim south, Christian rulers for the first time had to decide, well, I don't know, I've got this new population, they're not Christians, so how am I going to deal with them from a legal point of view? How am I going to define their status? And the way you did this in the medieval world is you issued a charter of protection. And that's essentially what these charters were. Now, I'm not going to, what follows in the notes are examples of such charters. So if you're interested, you know, read on. But the other thing that's interesting is I just want to keep going down to page, the bottom of page 6. And this will also, just to read the paragraph, which will summarize the essence of what it is, because you see, what actually happens is this, is that the rulers of state want to protect their Jews. Why do they want to protect their Jews? Don't tell me they love them. It's got nothing to do with they love them. They had something, they were useful to the crown. It was in their interest. And in fact, there's a legal term that enters into legal jargon in the Middle Ages, and the term is the Jews of the royal chamber, the Jews of the royal chamber. And often in legal documents, rulers refer to them as our Jews, our Jews. In other words, they had a vested interest in protecting them, right? But here's the problem. They wanted to protect their Jews, but the church had no interest in Jews rising to positions of prominence, because under the protection of these royal charters, they became financial advisors, they became quite well-to-do, etc. On the other hand, there was pressure from the church to act in a very, very different way. So the church would often put pressure on these rulers of state to adopt more discriminatory policies. So at the bottom of page 6, you can see here governmental rejection of church pressure. And one example of this is church initiatives were not always enthusiastically received by governmental authorities. So in this next letter, and you can read this on your own, we see evidence of the friction over the introduction of a radical ecclesiastical innovation, the Jewish badge. I'll talk about that in a moment. Enforcement of this Jewish badge in Castile caused serious problems for the rulers. Why did it cause serious problems? Because Jews, all of a sudden, who were contributing to the life of the city, if they had to wear the special badge, would have been discriminated against. So in view of the precipitous loss of royal income from these Jews, the king and the Archbishop of Toledo entreated the Pope at that time for permission to relax these new measures. And in this particular instance, the pontiff was responsive to the display of governmental opposition. And you can read the original correspondence between the Pope and the rulers. What is this badge? In the year of 1215, a very, very important church council came together. It was called the Fourth Lateran Council. They met in Rome. Lateran refers to a palace, the Lateran Palace. It's in Rome. And the Lateran Palace was a place where representatives of the church throughout Europe would come together from time to time to formulate church policy. And one of the topics under discussion on the agenda always was, what about the Jews? What should be our policy towards the Jews? Now, by the beginning of the 13th century, for reasons that I'm not even going to elaborate because it's a whole course in its own, but by the beginning of the 13th century, the situation of the Jews in Western Christendom under Christian rule had begun to deteriorate. And so by the beginning of the 13th century, things had got to a point where, particularly in the church, the Jews were actually seen as a threat to the survival of Christendom. It was born of irrational fantasies. You know, it's like, well, we get it today, like Jews own the world, Jews rule the world. So there was this idea that Jews had this power over Christians, and Christians were like dead scared of them by the beginning of the 13th century. It took a couple of centuries for this to actually happen. So what's one of the ways in which you deal with a problem like this? You have to know who is a Jew, because before the 13th century, the evidence suggests that Jews and Christians were actually mixing quite a lot together. There were no ghettos yet. Jews, they mixed, and there was social interaction. So one way of separating Jews out before you get to ghettoization, is distinctive dress. And in the year of 1215, they passed a law that required Jews to actually wear some distinguishing item of dress, whether it was a special hat, a badge, or whatever have you. That was introduced in 1215. And slowly it started to sort of come into play in various parts of Europe. But in Spain, as we have just read, because of such an important role that was held by the Jews in the period of the Reconquista, it was bad business to force the Jews to do this. And so it's remarkable, as you can just see in what I've just read, that it wasn't only the ruler of Toledo, but the Archbishop himself who appealed to the Pope to say, can you give us an exemption in the city of Toledo so that the Jews don't have to wear this? So indeed you can see that this was the best of times. As I said, it wasn't a garden of roses, but next week, just to keep David happy, we're going to sort of move into the worst of times, right? We're going to get the sort of the full-on, the full Monty, if you want, of anti-Semitism in all its glory. And we'll talk about why all of a sudden. I mean, that's the question. If for hundreds of years, a couple of hundred years at least, they've been doing well and faring well, why all of a sudden does the tide turn against them? So that's what we're going to pick up next week. Any final questions before we finish off for the night? If there are, I'm happy to answer them. Questions, comments? Okay, well, with that, I will see you next week. It is during Pesach, but we will continue. You know, it's Chol HaMoed, it's not an issue. And so just keep your eye out. The notes will sort of come out on Monday, probably. So just keep an eye out for your email on Monday. It's yeah, Monday. I know. Well, for some of you that might be an issue, but it'll be there by Monday. I'll probably be sending out over the weekend, but by Monday, if not early, I'll see what I can do. But certainly by Tuesday morning, in preparation for the session, it'll be there for you. Okay. Okay. All the best. Okay.
I like your dedication after being so ill and and still talking.
Well, you know, Jews suffer. You know, what do you want? You know, Jews make a virtue of suffering. What do you want?
Okay. You did well.
All right. All the best. And I know I said last week very enthusiastically, enjoy Pesach and so, but I was only rehearsing for this week. This week, I seriously mean have a very happy Pesach, right? I'm not a week out this time. Okay. All right. See you. All the best.
Thank you.
Okay. All the best.